Okay, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Rabbi Hillel Shaps. Most of you know me, I think. And I run Links. Links is a project of the Greater Washington Community Kollel. When things are normal, Links has a program weekly at the JCC with a class like this, but also one-on-one learning opportunities. And we hope that we'll be able to get back to that soon. Well, that's been on hold now for too long. So I'm excited to start a new topic tonight. We titled the series "In Their Footsteps: Life Lessons from Our Patriarchs and Matriarchs." Whenever we come around back to the beginning of the Torah, back to Parshas Bereshis, Genesis, it's always exciting because I love, and I know many love, the stories of the avos, the forefathers, the patriarchs, and the imahos, the mothers, the matriarchs, and there's just so much there. And so I was excited to choose that as the topic for this next series. And we're going to explore their lives and try to take away some good lessons that are relevant to us. This coming week's Parsha, which is Lecha, is basically our first introduction to Abraham, and we go for a few weeks with Abraham, and then we move on, like basically 1 week of Isaac, a few weeks of Jacob, of Yaakov, then we move on to Yosef. Now, we're not going to be following the Parsha necessarily, because I think we'll have more to say about the forefathers than we'll have time for if we just restrict it to just those few weeks. So just to give you a sense of how long this series is going to be, it's going to be, I have no idea how long. No, it's going to be, I don't know. I kind of make it up as I go along. I don't have the full curriculum. I have some ideas of things that I want to get to, what I want to talk about. My guess is it might go for 10 weeks or so, and then we'll pick something else for the next topic. But give or take, we'll be around that. Okay, so if you have the source sheet, you can follow along. If you don't have the source sheet, you can just listen. I am also going to drop it into the chat. So if you don't have it, you can grab it from there if you would like it. The only trick is that I have to just find it. And then I'll be able to do that. And there it is. Okay, so if you don't have it and you like it, it's now in the chat. You can download it from there. Okay, so we're actually going to start right off of the source sheet, and we're looking at a midrash. A midrash is an early teaching of our sages, going back to sometime following the destruction of the temple, so maybe 1,500 years or so, depending on the midrash. But they're often quoting earlier sources also, dating back as much as 2,000 plus years ago when we quote a midrash. So the sages of the midrash teach us the following. They say, each and every Jew is obligated to ask, when will my deeds equal the deeds of my forefathers? Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we can throw in the foremothers, the matriarchs, who are also we can look up to, and we're going to take lessons from them as well. When will my deeds equal those deeds? When will my character reach the level of their character? And that's to set a goal for ourselves in our lives. You know, we can certainly look at this and say, who are we kidding? You know, as we'll explore, we're talking about the forefathers, the foremothers, the matriarchs. These are the people who founded our people. Everything emanates from them, stems from them. These were great, great people. I don't think that I will ever really reach their level. So who are we kidding? Is this maybe a little bit arrogant, a little bit of an exaggeration to say, when will my deeds reach those deeds? The answer is probably never. But nonetheless, we have to ask the question. That's what they're telling us. You have to ask the question. And what it means is we have to set that as a goal. We have to realize that they were human, and even though they were way beyond us, perhaps, but they were able to attain their great levels, and we can also attain a great level if we learn from them. And so we have to have dreams. We have to have goals. We have to dream of perfection and always be trying to grow and to work on ourselves and to improve. Because although I've searched long and hard, I still haven't met anyone who's perfect. So we all can still hope to grow and really use the patriarchs and the matriarchs as examples, role models for ourselves for what level a person, a human being, can actually attain. Along these lines, the sages teach us, you see, we're going to talk about a lot of the stories, and sometimes I'm just going to reference them briefly, and then later we'll go into detail. But so, for example, when we come to Abraham looking for a wife for his son Yitzchak, his son Isaac, he sends his servant Eliezer to go find a wife, and the Torah is very, very lengthy about this process. It basically tells you everything that happened in him going to find a wife, and then he tells the story over to the people that he meets up with, and it repeats everything again. So it's extremely redundant and lengthy, so it seems at least. And so the sages there comment, and they say that, and this is the second source, the ordinary conversation of the patriarch's servants is more pleasing to God than even the Torah of their children. For the chapter of Eliezer, the account of his journey is repeated in the Torah, whereas many important principles of the law are derived only from slight indications given in the text. So the Torah the word Torah really means like moreh. It's a guide. It teaches the way. So much of Torah teaches us exactly how to conduct our lives. What are the laws by which we have to conduct ourselves? What we call halacha, the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah. That is a major part of the Torah. That's what guides our lives. But we find that often many of those laws are just barely hinted to. The Torah will say something very brief, and we'll have to, using modes of exegesis, which is an English word that you only know if you know what it means in Hebrew, but basically using different tools to interpret an extra word here, missing a word there, or repetition, different things, that we can derive certain laws, and it's part of our chain of tradition. So you can have a law that is barely hinted to, like by one extra letter or something. And on the other hand, here we have that the Torah repeats verse after verse after verse, seemingly redundantly. And so what the sages point out is, here we see how dear, so to speak, and this was just the conversation of the servant of Abraham. So we see how dear to God and how important even just the mere conversation of Abraham is, in comparison even to certain laws. Now, we're not going to say what's more important, but maybe we can say what's dear. It's obviously something that God has great love for. This is very important. This is very close to God's heart, so to speak, because the mere conversation is repeated in the Torah. And what this is teaching us is that we've got to pay attention to this. We've got to pay attention. If we have to pay so much attention to the mere conversation of a servant of Abraham, then certainly to the myriad of details that we have of the lives of Abraham, Sarah, Yitzchak's wife Rivka, Yaakov, Jacob and his wives, Rachel and Leah. So all of their lives are going to teach us, all the details of their lives are going to teach us essential and important lessons to apply to ourselves. And this is the approach that we have to have in studying the lives of the forefathers and of the foremothers, of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, is this approach that every every detail is important. It's all coming to teach me something. It's not teaching me explicit laws, so it must be teaching me in general how to conduct our lives. And again, it has to be with the outlook of how can I, from the first line, we have to ask ourselves, when will my deeds equal the deeds of my forefathers? It has to be with that outlook of dreaming, aiming, having a goal to try to emulate and live in the same manner that they did. So this is our approach in examining the lives of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. The book of Bereshis, the book of Genesis, is referred to actually in the book of Joshua, in the book of Yehoshua, and it's referred to as the Sefer HaYashar. The word Sefer means book. Yashar means literally straight, right? So if you ask for directions in Israel, so they'll say Yashar, 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 the Yashar, right? Straight, 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 and straight. And they might say Yamin, small, right, left, Yashar, Yashar. So Yashar means straight. So the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshis, is called the Sefer HaYashar, the book of the straight. So the Talmud, this is source number 3, it quotes this verse from Joshua. It says there, and the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the nation had avenged themselves of their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Yashar? So it has this it's kind of like a strange reference. Is this not written in the book of Yashar? Halohem kisubim al Sefer HaYashar. It's written in the book of Yashar. And this is referring to a miracle that happened in the days of Joshua. The Talmud actually goes on to see, where is this written? Where is this hinted to? We're not going to do that. We want to talk about what is the book of Yashar. So the Talmud goes on. It says, Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, this is Genesis, Bereshis, which is the book of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were called Yesharim. Here, this translation that I took from, they translate it as righteous. Again, more literally, it means straight. We'll have to try to define actually what it means, Yashar. Yesharim is the plural. They were called Yesharim. As it is stated, let me die the death of Yesharim. This is Bilam, the Gentile prophet, tried to curse the Jews. He ended up praising them. He ended up blessing them. But in within his words, one of the things he says is, let me die the death of the Yesharim, and he's referring to the patriarchs. So, and again, that's also its own topic, why he said that. But what we want to take away right now is that the patriarchs are called Yesharim. They're called straight ones, and so much so that the book of Genesis, which at the end of the day, Genesis is only in a certain way the beginning, right? The very beginning. And then after that, it's more about the patriarchs and the matriarchs. So it's also called, besides for being called the book of Bereshis, and besides for being called the book of Genesis, which also in our tradition, that's not just like a modern English or I guess whatever language that is term. We actually, within our tradition in the sages, we find that it's called the Sefer Yetzirah, which means of creation, which means Genesis. But it's also called Sefer HaYashar, the book of the straight. And that's because it's the book about the Yesharim, about the straight ones. So the forefathers are referred to as the Yesharim. And we have to understand, as we approach, try to gain perspective on their lives, why are they called Yesharim? Why are they called straight? What do we mean by that? So the Nitziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Berlin, was the dean of the yeshiva of Volozhin in, I guess that was in Russia. And the Nitziv, he explains as follows. He says, and I put part of it onto the source sheet, it's number 4. This was the praise of the forefathers. Besides for being tzaddikim and chasidim, which are different words for righteous, I guess they can specifically refer to different things, but he says, besides for that, and lovers of God to the greatest attainable degree, they were also yesharim. They were also straight, meaning they conducted themselves with the nations, even the worst idolaters, with love, and were concerned for their welfare. For this is how the world is sustained. Like we see how much Abraham put himself out to pray for Sodom. So this is referring to an episode where God says, the city of Sodom is full of evildoers. I'm going to destroy Sodom. Abraham doesn't say, yeah, that sounds about right. It's full of evildoers. Go ahead, destroy it. Abraham instead prays to God not to destroy it. And he prays, and one thing doesn't work, and he tries another thing, and that doesn't work, and he tries another thing. In the end, his prayers are not accepted, at least for that. But he tries very hard. He cares so much about Sodom. Even though it's people that he totally disagrees with their way of life. And I think would probably somewhat agree that they deserve what's coming to them. But yet he prays for them. And the Netziv understands that this is an example of being yashar. Still needs to be defined. Let's give some more examples, and maybe we could try to put some words to define it. He gives other examples. He says, and I just didn't put this on the source sheet, but he goes on and he says, he says, first of all, we find with his relationship with his nephew Lot. So Abraham gets into some arguments with his nephew Lot. Again, as we talked about, hopefully we'll explore some of the more details, but now just in a general sense, he gets into some arguments with his nephew Lot. He always treats him with tremendous respect, kind of says, you choose where you want to go. I'll take second choice, treats him with tremendous respect. He always wants what's best for him. And he references the title that Avram later receives. You see, Avram wasn't always Avraham. He started off with the name Avram without the ha. And then later God adds the hey, and it goes from Avram to Avraham. And at that time, God says, the reason I'm changing your name is because you are an Av Hamon Goyim, the father of a multitude of nations. So somehow Avraham represents like a father to all the nations. And the Netziv says you see this in his treatment of others. You see this in his treatment of Sodom. He's like a father, right? A father, even when the child does wrong, but the father is forgiving. The father has unlimited love for them, hopes for what's best for them. And this is really the approach of the Netziv, that the way he understands yashar, being straight, is always looking for what's sort of best for the world, for the sustenance of the world, for the society, for the society to be sustained, for the society to live on. He gives examples from the other forefathers, Isaac and Jacob, also where they also behave in this way, just trying to get along, even with those that they kind of quarrel with, but they're always being respectful. They're always giving the others the opportunity, the chance. And he says that this is what we term it often derech eretz. Derech eretz is literally the way of the land. So we have a statement in our sages, derech eretz kadma la Torah. That means that derech eretz comes before Torah. Derech eretz is, we say this to our kids, you have to have derech eretz. It means you have to be respectful. You have to respect others. And you have to have respect for others even before you have Torah. And that's what we have sort of in the setup of the Torah itself, is before the Torah, meaning before all the laws of the Torah, we have the behavior of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. And we have their conduct, which is derech eretz. They don't even have the Torah yet. The Torah wasn't given yet, but they're always conducting themselves with derech eretz, with respect for others, with care for others, and really with just looking out for what's best for others and what's best for society. and the maintenance and the sustenance of continued existence of the society around them. And the book of Bereshis, this book, which, like we said, it's also called Genesis, the book of creation. So it's not just the creation of the world, which it is at the beginning, but it's also the creation of life, the creation of society, and the way that the patriarchs were, that was a part of who they were in trying to continue and create a functioning and successful society rooted in respect for others and care. And that's one of the repeating themes. And again, that's something that they are intuiting on their own, that this is the way that we should conduct ourselves. It's not coming from a specific commandment from God to conduct themselves in this way. This is intuitive to them. And I think that's what what the Netziv is really saying, that Yashar, being straight, means sort of having the intuition to do what's right and what's best. That's the straightness of the forefathers, is just this intuitive knowledge of how to conduct oneself. And we have another example of this that's brought out by another one of the commentaries, someone more recent, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and he's discussing it in the context of another episode with Abraham, which is actually in this week's Torah portion, where there's this war that's going on in the days of Abraham, and it's these very powerful 4 kings, and they join together and they defeat all the other nations around them. There were 5 kings that they were up against. The 4 kings defeated the 5 kings, even though they were outnumbered apparently, but their armies won. And in the process, they captured Abraham's nephew Lot. So Abraham gathers his men and he goes and he rescues Lot. Now that's putting himself at great risk. He's taking on these very powerful kings. He's putting himself at risk, but he goes anyways. So the way that Rabbi Kamenetsky presents it, he says, well, imagine if Abraham had gone to his rabbi, which he didn't have, but imagine, nowadays someone's captured in that fashion. You go to your rabbi and you say, do I have an obligation to go and rescue him? So it's actually a very complicated question, whether one is even permitted to risk their life to save another life, because we value each life, and we actually put an individual's life comes before someone else's life in general, before a second person's. One should, like with the on the airplane with the gas masks that come down, put yours on before you help your child. So in general, in Jewish law, that's the general principle, is help yourself before you help someone else in terms when it comes to a life. Now there may be exceptions to that, but that's the general point. So the way he presents it is, let's say Abraham had gone to his rabbi and said, am I obligated to go fight these 4 kings, to go on this mission to rescue my nephew Lot? So the answer would probably have been that he is not obligated. So why did he do it? So Rabbi Kamenetsky says that Abraham did it because he felt that he had to, not just because his family, and you got to do what you can for family, but he actually felt indebted in a certain way to Lot. Now, why would he be indebted to Lot? What did Lot ever do for him? So there is something that Lot did for him one time, which was that when they went to Egypt and Avram was hiding Sarah, Lot was there, he didn't give it away. It's one thing Lot did for him. I think there's some who take that approach. That's why Avram felt indebted to him. But there's another approach, and this is the approach of Rabbi Kamenetsky, which is that he felt indebted to him for a different way, or not so much a debt to him, but responsible for him. Let's learn a little bit about what we know about Avraham's life before this week's Torah portion. And what we know about Avram's life before this week's Torah portion is not from any Torah portion, because last week's Torah portion was not about Avraham, or there was very little about him at the end. So what we know about Avraham from before he's really introduced in the Torah, we know from our tradition and from the Midrash. So the Midrash has the following somewhat famous parts of this I think are famous, but we'll read it together, and it's actually kind of entertaining, and then we'll come back to our point. So if you look at number 6, number 5 just talks about Lot being captured, and then Abraham hearing and going to rescue him. So number 6, this is a midrash. So the midrash says, and Haran died in the presence of his father Terach. Haran was Abraham's brother. Terach was Abraham's father. It says that Haran, Abraham's brother, died in the presence of his father Terach. So the sages teach us in the midrash as follows. Rabbi Chia said, again, we're on number 6. Terach was a manufacturer of idols. He once went away somewhere and left Abraham to sell them in his place. So you may remember this story. It's a true story brought in the midrash. So Abraham is now operating his father's idol shop. A man came in and wished to buy one. How old are you? Abraham asked the man. 50 years old, he said. So Abraham commented, woe to such a man who is 50 years old and would worship a day-old object. Right, this idol was just manufactured yesterday. You've been around for 50 years. You want to worship this idol? That doesn't make sense. On another occasion, a woman came in with a plate full of flour and requested of him, take this and offer it to them. Offer it to the idol as a karban, as an offering. So he took a stick and broke them, meaning he broke the idols with the stick, and then he put the stick in the hand of the largest. When his father returned, he demanded, what have you done to them? What did you do to the idols? So he says, I can't conceal it from you. A woman came with a plate full of fine meal, of flour, and requested me to offer it to them. One claimed I must eat first, while another claimed I must eat first. Thereupon the largest arose, took the stick, and broke them. So that's why the largest one is holding the stick, and he got the flour, and he broke the other ones. So his father said, what do you make sport of me? Have they knowledge? Terach said, should not your ear... So fine. So that was his response. What are you talking about? These idols don't have any knowledge. So Abraham said, should not your ears hear what your mouth has said? Thereupon, Terach seized him and delivered him to Nimrod. So now he's in trouble. He takes him to the king of the land, to Nimrod. So Nimrod says, let us worship fire. Come, my son. I'm sure we can change you. We can remediate you. Come, you're my friend. Let's go together. We're going to worship fire. So Avram said, let us rather worship water, which quenches fire. Why would you worship fire? Water puts out fire. Okay, Nimrod thought that was a great idea. Let's worship water. So then Avram says, let's worship the clouds, which bear the water. Okay, let's worship the clouds. So then Avram says, let's worship the wind, which disperses the clouds. Okay, great idea, Nimrod said, let's worship the wind. No, let's worship humans, which can stand up to the wind, Avram said. So now Nimrod's upset. He's had enough of him. He says, you're just joking with me. You're bandying words. We will worship nothing but the fire. Let's go back to the beginning. Behold, I will cast you into it. I'm going to throw you in the fire and let your God, whom you adore, come and save you from it. So you're insisting that there's one God. So here, my God against yours. I'm going to throw you into the fire. Let's see what happens. So now Haran, who was Abraham's brother, he wasn't sure what side to take. He was undecided. He said, if Abraham is victorious, I will say that I am of Abraham's belief. Well, if Nimrod is victorious, I will say that I am on Nimrod's side. So when Abraham descended into the fiery furnace and was saved, Nimrod asked him, so basically what happens is Abraham is thrown in the fire. God makes a miracle for him. He saves him from the fire, from the furnace. So now it's Haran's turn. So Nimrod asks Haran, Abraham's brother, so whose side are you on? Whose belief are you? Now Haran really didn't believe in Abram, but now that, didn't believe in Abram's God, but now that he had seen Abram saved, so now he says, okay, I'm with Abraham. So thereupon he seized him and cast him into the fire, and he was scorched and died in the presence of his father. So hence it is written, and Haran died in the presence of his father Terach. So that's all we have in the verse, is and Haran died in the presence of his father Terach, because his father was there when he was cast into the fire. So Haran was not saved because he wasn't really willing to sacrifice himself for God. He just, in the end of the day, when he saw that Avram was saved, so then he was willing to do so. So this is an important, very important story about sort of Abraham's beginnings, and we'll come back and discuss it more a little bit soon. But back to our question of why Abraham felt responsible for saving Lot. So says Rabbi Kamenetsky, well, Lot's an orphan because his father Haran, when I say that Lot was his nephew, he was the son of Haran. So his father Haran died. Avram felt that it was somewhat his fault. He was somewhat responsible for Haran's death. Not that he had caused it directly, but he felt some amount of responsibility for Haran's death, leaving Lot orphaned. And therefore, Avram felt some responsibility, and that's why he went to try to save Lot, even though it was at great risk to himself. So the way that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky puts it, though, is that this is yashrut. This is straightness. This is when we say that Avraham is a yashar, is a straight one. So it means it's not an explicit law like this. He wasn't necessarily required to do this, but it's what we might call menschlichkeit. It's being a mensch. It's doing what's proper, doing what's right. And sometimes, not everything is explicit, an explicit law in the Torah. Sometimes you have to know intuitively what's the right thing to do. And that's again this idea of yashrut, of straightness coming through, this intuitive sense of this is just I'm doing it just because it's the right thing to do. And therefore he felt that he should, even though he was risking himself, go and rescue Lot. And this is what a theme that is recurring in the lives of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, which is they're living in a way. Sometimes God commands them to do things, but much of it is their intuitive sense of what is right. It could be it could be just pure intuition. It could be that there's more. There's Kabbalistic ideas, sort of how they knew exactly what to do. But they sort of on their own were able to determine the proper way to live to some extent, and that falls under this description of being yashar, just being straight. And this is a term that we use nowadays. Sometimes, and it's a great if we can be described as someone who is yashar, someone who's straight, a straight shooter, so to speak, but not necessarily in the sense that they just someone who just does the right thing. They just do what's right. So it doesn't seem like much, but it really is. It really is a great trait to have, to be able to intuitively know what's the right thing to do in a given situation, in relationships, and that's really what this all is with Avram. It's different people that he's encountering and how he relates to them, and it's all with this sense of yashrus, of straightness, of just intuitively knowing what's the right thing to do, and derech eretz, respect for others. So that's the introduction to Abraham based on this description found in the book of Joshua, of this book, Sefer HaYashar, the book of the straight ones, that the avos, the forefathers, had this quality of intuitive sense of the right thing to do. Okay, want to see a very important introduction to who Abraham was and what he accomplished, and that is through the eyes of the Rambam of Maimonides. If I can find the right page here. Yeah. So back to the source sheet. We're looking at number 7. It's another longer source, but Maimonides, the Rambam, gives us a whole description of at least the beginnings of Avram's life, a lot of which is off the page, so to speak. It's not in the Torah. It's in the tradition, in the sages, in the Midrash, in the Talmud. And this is actually found in the very beginning of the laws pertaining to idol worship. So Rambam Maimonides wrote a work called Mishnah Torah, where he goes through all the laws of the Torah, all the mitzvos, and all the technical details of all the laws. And in the section before he deals with all the laws dealing with idolatry, so he gives sort of an introduction to the history of idolatry, of how people fell into worshiping idols. And part of that history is Abraham emerging as a believer and a promoter of monotheism, of belief in one God. So he says, after this mighty man Abraham was weaned, he began to explore and think. So already from a very young age, Abraham was thinking, he was looking at the world. And though he was a child, he began to think incessantly throughout the day and night, wondering, how is it possible for the sphere to continue to revolve without having anyone controlling it? Who is causing it to revolve? Surely it does not cause itself to revolve. So one of the examples that Maimonides gives is how does the world turn? It must be that there's a God causing it to turn. I think there's another midrash, which I saw quoted, which Avram used a similar logical progression that he did when he later encountered Nimrod. So we saw in the midrash that Avraham, when he was speaking to Nimrod, he followed a progression. He said to Nimrod said, let's worship fire. So Avram says, well, why not worship water? Because water beats fire, like rock, paper, scissors. I guess there's no fire and water there, but water beats fire. So fine. So he said, let's worship the water. So he said, okay, no, let's worship the clouds, because clouds hold water. So the water can't be the God. The clouds hold the water. Then he said, let's worship the wind, and he followed this whole progression. So there's actually another midrash that was a similar logical progression that Avraham used in sort of coming to the conclusion of one God. I'm just going to bring it up here. Sorry, 1 second, just so I quote it correctly. Here we go. So it says as follows. The Midrash says, Avram questioned, why should we bow down to idols? Gods that we ourselves make. We should bow to the earth. Bow to the earth. It produces the crops that sustain us. We should worship the earth. So he began to worship the earth. It's interesting. It says he worshiped the earth because it made more sense than worshiping idols. And then it says he saw that the earth needs rain. So he began to worship the sky. Then he saw that actually the most brilliant creation in the sky was the sun. So he began to worship that. But then the sun set and the moon rose. So he began to worship the moon. And when the sun rose the next morning, he didn't know what to do. He couldn't figure out which one was stronger, the sun or the moon. So that was sort of the types of thoughts that he was going through, because everybody was just worshiping whatever, but he kind of canceled each one out, because it can't be, because this one goes away and that one goes away and this one beats this one and that one. Can't be that any of these is God. There must be something more powerful than all of it. This was already from a young age, the thought progression that Avraham went through. So it says he had no teacher. We're back in Maimonides and the Rambam. We're on the 4th line. He had no teacher, nor was there anyone to inform him. Rather, he was mired in Ur-Kasdim. That's where he lived among the foolish idolaters. His father, mother, and all the people around him were idol worshippers, and he would worship with them. However, his heart was exploring and gaining understanding. So he was thinking, he was exploring. Ultimately, he appreciated the way of truth and understood the path of righteousness through his accurate comprehension. He realized there was one God who controlled the sphere, that he created everything, and that there was no other God among all the other entities. He knew that the entire world was making a mistake. What caused them to err was their service of the stars and images. Okay, that's going back to something he discussed earlier. Abraham was 40 years old when he became aware of his creator. So there was a process here. We have a midrash, I think, that says he was 3 years old. The way the Rambam understands this is at 3 years old, he began exploring. By the time he was asking these questions, he was thinking. It was a process. At 40 years old is where he kind of arrived at his conclusion. And when he recognized and knew him, he began to formulate replies to the inhabitants of Ur-Kasdim and debate with them, telling them that they were not following a proper path. So we saw that an example of that in that midrash where he's debating his father about the idols. He broke their idols and began to teach the people that it is fitting to serve only the God of the world. To him alone is it fitting to bow down, sacrifice, etc. Fine. Conversely, it is fitting to destroy and break all the images, all these idols, lest all the people err concerning them. Next paragraph, when he overcame them through the strength of his arguments, the king desired to kill him. That was the midrash that we read. He was saved through a miracle and left for Haran. There he began to call in a loud voice to all people and inform them that there is one God in the entire world. Sorry, I was calling Abraham's brother Haran the whole time. His name was Haran, without the Cha. The Haran is the city that he traveled to. There he began to call in a loud voice to all people and inform them that there is one God in the entire world and it is proper to serve him. So basically, Avram goes out on this mission and he starts teaching people about monotheism, about how there's only one God. And he was very good at this. He would go out and call to the people, gathering them in city after city and country after country until he came to the land of Canaan, proclaiming God's existence the entire time, as Genesis states, and he called there in the name of the Lord, the eternal God. When the people would gather around him and ask him about his statements, he would explain them to each one of them according to their understanding until they turned to the path of truth. Ultimately, thousands and myriads gathered around him. These are the men of the house of Abraham. The Torah references them at the beginning of this Torah portion. I'm not sure how Maimonides knew how many there were. I'm not sure. There could be that he has a source for that, I imagine. He planted in their hearts this great fundamental principle, composed texts about it, and taught it to Isaac, his son, and then Isaac to Jacob, and etc. So Abraham, first of all, discovered, he came to the conclusion. Now, it had been known previously, but it had kind of been forgotten. He was able to come to the conclusion that there was just one God. And not only that, but he was very successful in sharing and spreading the word about this. So this is the beginnings of Abraham's life. And I want to sort of come back to this also in the last section of the class to bring out an idea that relates to this and really connect that to the concept of yashar being straight and intuitive, as we'll see soon. But before we do that, so the next source on the page is a very important Mishnah, a teaching of the sages in Pirkei Avos, in Ethics of the Fathers, and it's number 8, and it says there were 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, and then in the next one it says, line number 3, Mishnah number 3. With 10 trials was Abraham, our father, may he rest in peace, tried. Abraham was given 10 tests. He withstood them all to make known how great was the love of Abraham, our father, peace be upon him. So the Mishnah teaches us that Abraham encountered 10 tests in his life. Now, the Mishnah does not tell us what those 10 tests were, and that is the subject of debate among the great commentaries. But it does tell us that he had 10 tests. So some examples of what those tests may have been. So on some lists, we have that midrash that we read about, the encounter with Nimrod and being thrown into the fiery pit and standing up and resisting. And that would be one example of a test that Abraham underwent. Another example that is, I think everybody has on their list, is from the beginning of this week's Torah portion, Lech Lecha, go for you, where God says to leave your birthplace and go to the land that I will show you, which is going to be the land of Canaan. That's on everybody's list. Obviously, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, is on everybody's list. And there are various other events that make up the 10. So what is the purpose of this, though? Why does Abraham have to undergo 10 tests? What's the message of this? What's the purpose of it? Why is God testing? In the commentaries discuss sort of what it means that God tests. God knows what's going to happen, So some say that you have to still bring it out into reality. That's using your free will. Others say that test isn't really the best word for it. It's really the word nes, which means nisayon is a test, is the same root as the word nes, which is a miracle, and also the same word as the word banner. So it's sort of when a person goes through a nisayon, a test, and withstands it, so they are creating a banner, an announcement sort of, about God, for God. So there's that approach. But what's going on here? Why is it necessary for Abraham to go through these 10 tests? So Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin explains very beautifully. He first of all points out that if you look closely at the Mishnah, these two Mishnahs that I put down, the first one I only put the first line because that's all we need for this. It says there were 10 generations from Noach to Abraham, and it does not call him Abraham, our father there. It just says Abraham. The very next Mishnah says, with 10 trials was Abraham, our father, tried. So there it says, calls him Abraham Avinu, Abraham, our father. So why the switch from one Mishnah to the next? First, it didn't call him Abraham Avinu, Abraham, our father. The very next Mishnah, it calls him Abraham Avinu, Abraham, our father. So Rav Chaim of Volozhin says very beautifully. He says that the concept of the trials that Abraham undergoes, the purpose of them is that as our father, he is sort of planting the seeds for us, for also to be able to overcome similar trials and tribulations. It's sort of creating, in general, he says that maybe on a more immediate level, a father, a grandfather, a mother, a grandmother, so they're able to pass on certain traits to their children, and not only that, but certain things that they've been able to overcome, so they pass on that trait to their child to make it a little bit easier for their child to overcome. And that's the concept, he says, of Abraham. Abraham is by God putting Abraham through this experience, Abraham as the father of all the Jewish people, God is putting into our spiritual DNA, so to speak, the ability to overcome and transcend similar tests and similar experiences. And he says, you wonder, where did the Jews throughout the generations get that ability to just give up their lives for the sake of heaven, give up their lives for the sake of God? Even simple Jews, even Jews that weren't so knowledgeable, weren't so righteous necessarily, but when their religion is on the line, so even the simplest Jews were willing to give up their lives. Where does that come from, he says? He says it comes from that inheritance, that Abraham was willing to sacrifice himself and be thrown into the fiery furnace by Nimrod to stand up for his beliefs. He says, where does it come from that you see people, you still see it today, all of a sudden, they're like, okay, I'm moving to Israel. Really? What are you going to do there? How are you going to make a living? I don't know. I'll figure it out. Right? I'm moving to Israel. Where does that come from? Where do we get that strength to just decide to do that? He says that comes from Lech Lecha, the test that Avram underwent to get up, leave his birthplace, and just move to the land of Israel. And that's the same, he says, with all of the tests and trials that Abraham underwent. Some of the tests were related to his children. Yishmael, not the easiest son, not having a child for a long time. All of these tests were challenging, and but by going through them, experiencing them, and overcoming them, so he is implanting within us the ability to overcome similar trials. We'll have to explore the tests a little bit more, sort of the experiences of Avram, to really try to zero in on what they were. What was the test of Akedas Yitzchak, of sacrificing his son? Obviously, that's a test, but there's so much that can be said about it. And these ideas, the fact that Avram was able to overcome them is very empowering for us to be able to overcome similar trials, because we have it within us. We have that ability planted within us from our ancestor Avraham.
Rabbi?
Yes.
How is it that Avraham performing certain tests, overcoming certain tests, how does that transfer to us?
That's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. And I can't say that I know the answer for sure. I did see it discussed. Again, it gets more into a Kabbalistic realm of how our actions have reactions. Our actions, I mean, this takes us back to Nefesh HaChaim, which I'm sure you remember every word that we learned together from it, however, 6 years ago or whatever it was. So our actions have spiritual impact in ways that we can't imagine. So our again, very, very, Kabbalah in like 10 seconds, the little that I know, our souls are in a spiritual way, they go all the way up to the highest spiritual realms, and our actions shoot all the way up, and then they reverberate down into all areas. So the actions of the greater the person, the greater the reverberation, so to speak, of their actions. So the actions of the forefathers have tremendous impact on the future of the world. So maybe we'll get into it more next week, possibly, or maybe we'll say that it's above us, but we'll see. But it's that concept of it works on a spiritual level. We don't see we know that our mitzvos, our good deeds, have spiritual consequence. We don't see exactly what that is, but in that same sense, the actions of the forefathers can have spiritual consequence for their offspring. Okay, I want to just close with one more idea, taking us back to the test of Lecha. So as I mentioned, there are different ways to count the tests of Avraham. So the great medieval commentary, Rabbeinu Yonah, in his commentary on the Mishnah, so he says test number 1 was Avraham being thrown into the fiery furnace. Test number 2 was Lech Lecha, was Avraham being sent to leave his birthplace and go to Canaan. But Maimonides, who also has a commentary on Pirkei Avos, on this Mishnah, he says actually, he basically insists that all the tests are explicit in the Torah. So therefore, he doesn't count, or custom, he doesn't count the test of the furnace, and he counts Lech Lecha as the first test. So it's difficult to understand why that should be. At the end of the day, giving up his life, being willing to be thrown into the fiery furnace, that just seems like such a greater test than Lech Lecha. Then go, leave your land and go to another place. Especially because if you read the verses, it doesn't seem like such a big test. Look over here, number 9. And the Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Okay, so far it's looking challenging because he's telling him to leave his birthplace. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will aggrandize your name, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you. So, he promises him, God says, go, and then I'm going to make you into a great nation and bless you. And you're going to have all great things. And And he says, Lech Lecha, go for you. It's for your benefit. So if God says that if you go there, you're going to be made into a great nation and it's going to be for your benefit. So is that really such a big test to have to leave your, yeah, I mean, it could be hard to leave home, but is that really such a test? And to count that and not count being willing to be thrown into the fiery furnace, why should that be? So Rabbi Matisyahu Solomon explains, based on other commentaries really, but brings together a few ideas, which is going to tie us back to where we started tonight. And that is that the test of Abraham of Lech Lecha, of go, leave your land, was not really whether he would be willing to go, but it's more about why he would go. Would he go because of all that God promised him? Or would he go because God told him to go? And he would do it because that was God's will and because he wanted to follow God's will. And that's it's a difference. And it's a very big difference, especially for Abraham, because we have to understand that this is, at least in the Torah, the first time that we see that God speaks to Abraham. This is his first command. You know, after all these years, I think Abraham is now 75, I think. After all these years, this is finally the moment God appears to him and gives him a command, tells him what to do after all these years. And so what's Abraham used to? You know what Abraham's used to? He's used to being yashar. He's used to being straight, intuitively knowing what to do, what's best. And you know what? He was amazing at it. He is the yashar. He's the straight one. He's the one who knows what to do. And he made his life out of that. Not only in the way that he dealt with people, not only in the way that the respect that he had, but even more than that. His whole life was about intuitively knowing what to do or discovering it on his own, but coming to conclusions on his own. He came to the conclusion on his own that there's one God. He then made his whole life dedicated to that. He gave up everything for it. He sacrificed his life for it. He then went and recruited people, and he was the ultimate outreach worker, and he brought people in. But all of this is coming not from a single commandment from God. It's all coming from within him. It's all coming from, I know what to do. I can figure out what's right, because he was so good at that. So now all of a sudden he gets a command. He gets a command. Now, obviously, this is the right thing to do, not just because of the command, because this is how he's going to be built into a great nation. This is the best thing that can happen to him. This is the best thing that can happen for his goals and what he knows is best for the world and for him. But he has to realize, he has to take a step back, that there's what I know intuitively, and then there's what God tells me to do. And there will be times that those things aren't going to be exactly aligned. And maybe what I think is intuitively the right thing to do may one day turn out not to be the right thing to do in a given moment. Because at the end of the day, the right thing to do is whatever God says is the right thing to do. This is God's world. So at this moment, Abraham can go, he can lech lecha, he can go for one of two reasons. He could go because this is exactly what he needs, and this is what the world needs, and this is the best thing that can happen for him and for his mission to spread the word of God, or to spread, knowledge of God. Or he could go simply because God said to do it, much without all his own calculations, and that it makes sense to me. And what does it say? It says, and Avram went as the Lord had spoken to him. Kasher diber ito, or oso, as God had said to him. He didn't go because he thought it made sense. He went because God commanded him to do it. And that was a great test for him, because he had spent all this time doing whatever he thought was best, and being absolutely right, by the way, but doing what he thought was best. And now he's all of a sudden going to do it for a different reason. And this is a very important testing. It's going to be very important for him throughout his life, but it's a very important lesson, which is that, yes, we can often intuit what's right. And it's so important to always, to live our lives that way and try to just be good people, right? And do what's right and do the right thing. But there will be times where what we think may be best may not align with what God says to do. And maybe we need to, at times, reframe our perspective, reframe our thinking based on the word of God. And so even though Avram spent his whole life knowing what to do intuitively, knowing what's right, but now he takes his first, according to my mom, he's the first test is now, God says, now you're with me. Now I'm going to give you an instruction. Are you going to do it simply because you think that's what's the best thing to do? Or are you going to do it because God says that it's the best thing to do? And whether you understand it or not, you would still do it. And that's the first test that Avram is giving. And he passes with flying colors. Avram went as the Lord had spoken to him. He went because God said, that's why I'm going to do it. Okay, we will stop there.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Sheps.